Hey Warriors, this video is for U.S. history, and we're going to begin to talk about the American Civil Rights Movement. This is found on page 43 of your U.S. history booklet, and you may notice we've skipped pages 40, 41, and 42. Those are pages that already have video links inserted in them. You can watch those videos and take your notes on that material, World War II and the Cold War, and then we don't need to make more videos about that. There are already videos on those pages. So today, the American Civil Rights Movement. This movement began in many ways in 1954 with the Supreme Court decision in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. In this case, the Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional to force black children and white children to attend different schools solely by virtue of their race. And so this becomes an important decision, not just for the arena of public education in this country, because this leads to the desegregation of the public school system, but it also becomes important because if the Supreme Court decides that it's unconstitutional to force children of different races to attend different schools designed specifically for their race, shouldn't it also be unconstitutional to force people to ride in different train cars if they're different races? Remember Plessy versus Ferguson? Or drink at different water fountains? Or eat in different restaurants? Or use separate restrooms? Or separate movie theaters? This Supreme Court decision in 1954 becomes the catalyst, or it becomes kind of the initiating event that causes members of the American Civil Rights Movement to begin to protest and to engage in acts of activism that say, look, if it's unconstitutional to segregate children in school, it should be unconstitutional to segregate black and white people in every area of their lives. And so now as the American Civil Rights Movement begins to kind of roll, you see that these protests and this activism is aimed at desegregating the bus system, for instance, rather famously in Montgomery, Alabama. This is where Rosa Parks was at the center of the bus boycott. People of color who were accustomed to riding the buses, but were also accustomed to sitting in the back of the bus, said, look, we're not going to ride the bus anymore until you change the rules. And they refused to ride the public bus system in Montgomery, Alabama for over a year, about 13 months in fact. How did they get to work? They walked, they carpooled, they took a taxi, they got there however they could, but they weren't going to ride the bus. And so the majority of the passengers on that bus system were no longer buying bus fares, and the buses were riding around Montgomery, Alabama. Most of the time they were empty. And so finally the bus company gives in and says, look, we're going to desegregate the bus lines. Victory. So this is one example of how peaceful protest, a boycott, a refusal to do business with a company that was acting unjustly, created change in society. You also have an example during the American Civil Rights Movement of what were called sit-ins. There used to be diners. You used to go into a little department store, like nobody knows what a Woolworths is anymore, but a little store that had all kinds of different products in it. All of a sudden, often there would be a little restaurant bar in there. And so people would go in and eat their lunch. And the rules at the time in many of these southern states were that if you were white, you could go sit at the bar and order your lunch and eat it there. If you were black, you were not allowed to sit where the white customers sat. You could go around back and order a meal and you could take it to go. But you weren't allowed to sit at the counter. So another form of protest became black college students coming in and sitting down at these restaurant counters. And they sat down, and whoever was working behind the counter said, we're not going to serve you. We don't serve black people in the restaurant. You have to go take your order out back. And they said, no, I'm going to sit here until you take my order and serve my lunch, and I'm going to eat it right here at the counter. So they began to disobey laws that they thought were unfair. This is referred to as civil disobedience, disobeying the laws, knowing that there would be a consequence for that, maybe a ticket, maybe an arrest, but They wanted to break these laws and be ticketed or be arrested to bring publicity to the fact that these were unfair laws, that they were unconstitutional. If it's unconstitutional to segregate the school system, it should be unconstitutional to segregate restaurants also. And so at the heart of this civil disobedience was a commitment to nonviolent resistance. Many times you could watch old videos, old video footage of restaurant sit-ins, and you'll see how some of the protesters were treated. They were beaten, they were pulled off their stools, they were kicked, they had all kinds of food and ketchup and salt and pepper and coffee and all kinds of things poured on them. People put cigarette butts out on them. They were absorbing all kinds of violence and abuse. And their commitment was that they were not going to fight back. Non-violent resistance. And so this becomes a very, very successful strategy in the American Civil Rights Movement. Because if you see one group of people beating on someone and they're refusing to defend themselves, refusing to fight back, it's usually pretty easy to see that there's one group of people behaving badly and another person or another group of people who is not behaving badly. Okay, they're absorbing that punishment maybe, but they're not fighting back. And so in this nonviolent resistance, in this strategy of nonviolent resistance, it became very easy to see that one group of people was willing to engage in violence and one group of people was not. And that kind of gives you this idea of maybe one group being on what you might refer to as a moral high ground. Okay, they may have moral justification for doing what they're doing. And then the other group, you might look at them and say, well, they are behaving kind of badly. Why are they doing that? Nobody's even fighting back. Another reason why nonviolent resistance was very effective was because at this time in the 1950s and 1960s, news programs on television began to go out into the community, and they weren't just in a studio, filming somebody talking, but they began to go out with camera crews and they began to videotape, they began to film these protests and these activists and the way that they were being treated and what they were trying to accomplish. And now all of a sudden people are sitting down in the evening watching the evening news on television, and they're getting a very clear picture, video footage of what life was like for black people in America, what kinds of obstacles they were facing, and how they were treated when they tried to stand up for their own rights. The other reason this was effective was because this civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance was led in great part by Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister. And at the heart of the principles of nonviolent resistance is love. It's this idea that love is going to conquer hate. You're not going to, beat a person into believing the way you believe. You're going to allow them to act out on you, and you're going to believe that by not striking back, by not resisting with force or with violence, but with love, that you can convert that person's way of thinking. And so the kind of spiritual thread that runs through this strategy of nonviolent resistance made it very, very strong in people. And make no mistake, people in this, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s kind of arm of the American Civil Rights Movement, had to commit wholeheartedly to this strategy of nonviolent resistance. If you had 100 people protesting and one person gets mad and decides to fight back, the whole thing is ruined. And in fact, members of the American Civil Rights Movement and the SNCC, they practiced being able to absorb punishment. There's a movie. I'll put a link to a clip in the description below this video. There's a movie called Freedom Song, and there's a scene in it where members of the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're practicing their role playing and essentially just abusing one another, calling one another names, getting in one another's faces, spitting on each other, pouring milk on each other, and they're trying to get the other person to snap. Okay? These are the role plays and the trainings that they actually went through to be able to make sure that they could keep their cool when violence was directed toward them. Okay, so I'll leave a description, or I'll leave a link in the description below, and I'll also leave a link that gives some video footage about those sit-ins so you can see what kind of treatment people had to endure when they were protesting in those little restaurants and the department stores. Okay, so we should have 3 reasons why the nonviolent resistance movement was successful. There are also on the back page, on page 44, is a description of nonviolent resistance and the 6 principles of nonviolent resistance. Number 5, again, the thread that runs through this is kind of a spiritual or religious one, and that is that nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. And people believe that love is more powerful than hate, that love would conquer, would overturn that hatred. So this has just been kind of an introduction to the American Civil Rights Movement, some of the thinking, some of the principles behind it, and the tactics that were used. But in a general sense, the aim here is to work at overturning all those parts of society that had been segregated through Jim Crow laws, and to mix and integrate society in a way that was fair for every citizen. That's it for this video. I'll see you next time.